Welcome to Alan History Nerd. This video is going to look at social developments 1951 to 1964. It's part of our playlist on A-Level History 2S Modern Britain 1951 to 2007. And I'm going to leave you in Tom's capable hands, and Tom is going to continue building on his previous video where he set out a good number of these social developments. He's going to look at other aspects and take this a little bit further. Enjoy.
Hi everyone. In our previous video we had a look at some of the very significant social developments between 1951 and 1964, focusing in particular on changing attitudes to class and the establishment, focusing on rising living standards and the growth in consumerism and affluence, and thinking as well about attitudes towards the role of women in society. This video will explore some other themes around social change, thinking in particular about race and immigration, and also about youth culture, as well as people's attitudes towards issues that had previously been a taboo in society, especially around the censorship of sexually explicit publications. As we saw in the previous video, the two themes which run in parallel here are, first of all, the fact that there is undoubtedly significant social change in each of these areas, but that at the same time Britain remains in some ways a relatively traditional society. So while there is undoubted social change, the pace of change in some ways is relatively gradual. Let's think first of all about immigration, and this is a very prominent aspect of changing British society in the 1950s. A key term that you need to be aware of is the new Commonwealth. Now, the Commonwealth was the loose grouping of countries that was replacing the British Empire after World War II, of course. The British Empire had begun to crumble, and there were various countries which had only recently become independent. India and Pakistan, and also parts of the West Indies, of the Caribbean as well. We call those the new Commonwealth countries. And Britain was very keen to say to people in those countries that Britain ultimately saw itself as the mother country still, as the home country, and there was a welcome extended to people from those countries who wanted to move as immigrants to Britain as well. We see the first wave of immigrants coming from the Caribbean on a ship, which we've heard actually quite a lot about in the last few years. The ship was called the Empire Windrush, and you may have heard these people referred to as the Windrush generation. There's actually been quite a lot of controversy in recent years about the way that many of them were treated, even up to the modern day. What you need to know in terms of this Britain unit is that these are the first Caribbean immigrants to Britain in any great numbers. There's just under 500 people on the ship. That number has grown to over 210,000 from across the new Commonwealth by 1958. So the arrival of the Windrush marks the beginnings of something which is going to have a significant impact, partly on the British economy, but also on British society too. One interesting fact about those immigrants is that the vast majority, 3/4 of them, are male. A lot of them have come over alone and are sending regular payments back to support their families, whether it's back in India, Pakistan, or places like Jamaica, for example. If we're going to break it down further, we'd see that the biggest group of immigrants comes from the Caribbean, but numbers from India and Pakistan are pretty significant too. We also see quite a bit of immigration in this period from the Republic of Ireland, particularly in areas such as Liverpool, for instance. One feature of this period which is often overlooked is there's actually a really big number of migrants who are leaving Britain, so people who are emigrating from Britain to other countries. Australia is very popular destination, partly because the Australian government is really keen to encourage immigration at this point from Britain. The government there even helps with some of the cost of travel and some of the cost of housing as well. You also see people from Britain moving to the US and to Canada as well. And a really crucial statistic, which again isn't always reflected in discussions around immigration, is that outward migration is greater than inward migration. In other words, emigration out of Britain is greater than immigration into Britain. And you can see the statistics there speak for themselves. That's true both in the 1950s and also in the 1960s. Although immigration moves over the 1 million mark, emigration is almost at the 2 million mark. Nevertheless, there are some really difficult issues which emerge as a result of immigration, and we see in certain parts of the country a rise in racist attitudes and also, unfortunately, in racist incidents as well. It's a mixed picture across the country. There are communities who are very welcoming to immigrants, who have a very tolerant approach, who welcome the fact that immigrants are going to boost their local economy. So in some towns and villages across Britain, we see a real willingness of local communities not only to welcome but to work with and to get along with recent immigrants. But as I say, it's a mixed picture, and other immigrants find hostility, find resentment and bitterness among the local population, and who find in some cases outright racism as well. The government is very, very concerned by this. Clearly, any rise in tension in society is dangerous. But not only that, the Conservative and Labour governments across this period realise that immigration does benefit the economy. And although there's always a lot of rhetoric about immigrants stealing people's jobs, the reality is that a lot of immigrants did a lot of low-wage jobs that some British people simply were not prepared to do, and that was certainly the case in the factories. So the government is keen to encourage immigration and keen to ensure that immigrants face as positive a reception as possible when they come to Britain. There are certain areas, though, despite the government's best efforts, where racial tension is very much rising. By the late 1950s, there are two examples there. One of them is Nottingham, and we can see some really appalling attitudes from local white young people there, hunting down black immigrants. Also Notting Hill, famously an area of Caribbean immigration, and of course we all know the annual Notting Hill Carnival in August bank holiday, a great celebration of that culture. But in the late 50s we have great racial tension in Notting Hill in West London. A lot of the immigrants there from Jamaica and Barbados and Trinidad, although they have been keen to come to Britain, end up in great poverty. A lot of them suffer from very poorly run rented housing. There's a lot of corrupt landlords in the area, housing is overcrowded, and these immigrants in many cases are simply exploited by these landlords. We end up with race riots in Notting Hill, and this is caused by white rioters at first, being violent against the immigrants, and some of the immigrants fight back. There's violence on both sides, but nevertheless, it's clear where this has begun. The police are taken off guard, they're taken by surprise, and they struggle to contain these riots. So there's real concern at government level about the impact that immigration is having on social tensions. It doesn't help that you've got a very small but very vocal group of British fascists. A key name here is Oswald Mosley. Now, you may have come across Oswald Mosley before. During the 1930s and World War II, Mosley founded the British Union of Fascists. He was an admirer and a friend of Hitler. Now, that organisation had never got very far. Mosley was utterly disgraced by his associations with Hitler. Nevertheless, despite having been in prison during the war, he came back fighting in the 1950s, and he decided to stand in the 1950 election in the 1959 election in the constituency of Kensington North. That's the parliamentary seat that includes Notting Hill. And Mosley is blatantly stirring up tensions here, trying to exploit the race riots for his political gain. Although Mosley doesn't win the seat, it doesn't help the overall situation in Notting Hill, particularly because Mosley's policies are quite blatantly racist. He says that immigrants need to go home. The official word for that, the formal vocab is repatriation. Mosley stands on the platform of saying immigrants must be sent home. And although Mosley doesn't get anywhere, and although ultimately a lot of these race riots do inevitably die down, it's clear to the government that there needs to be some sort of reaction to it. Public opinion is shifting. There is concern among elements of the public about the impact of immigration. And therefore, Macmillan's government passes the Commonwealth Immigration Act. It's interesting because Labour at the time was very much opposed to it. Labour said, we don't want to limit immigration in this way. Immigrants bring great benefit to the economy. By limiting immigration, we're simply pandering to these racist attitudes. So Labour very firmly against this. But interestingly, Labour does not overturn or repeal the Act when it comes to power. It's clear that a new consensus is developing that immigration is still welcomed, that the benefits of immigration are still recognised, but with an eye on the possible social tensions, governments are also beginning to recognise that limits on immigration may be needed. Another really important development during this period is the growth of youth culture. And it seems like a strange thing to say that youth culture appears in the 1950s, because clearly the young people have existed throughout history. But the 1950s is different. This is really the first time that we get an identifiable youth culture. The word teenager is being used regularly for the first time during this period. And what do we mean by this? Well, what we mean is that more so than in previous generations, young people are prepared to be out there and saying to their parents, actually, we don't really like the attitudes you have on all sorts of issues. We don't particularly like the way you dress or the music you listen to, and we want to be different, and we will be different. And this challenging of the attitudes, the culture of the older generation feels different to previous decades. And so we talk about the emergence of a real separate youth culture during the period. Once again, there are economic causes. Young people do have more time. Girls, for example, had generally spent a lot of time in the home helping their mothers with the washing, for instance. Now, as soon as washing machines are around or fridges, so you don't have to do a daily shop, all of a sudden, teenage girls have more time on their hands. It's true with boys as well. National service, which had existed after the war and had meant that boys were conscripted, usually into the armed forces, for a couple of years after school, had been abolished in 1960. So again, young men had more time on their hands too. And we see the impact of that in this breakaway from the culture of the older generation. New music, we've got the rise of pop music. This is the era of the Beatles, of the Rolling Stones, for example. New fashions as well. It's not that long before the miniskirt is invented, for example. And also, although we're not quite in the Costa and Starbucks era yet, coffee bars are the new fashionable thing, and the more traditional tea houses are seen very much as parental culture, old-fashioned fuddy-duddy things. Quite interesting as well that not only are young people more willing to challenge adult culture, but on a really simple level, there are more teenagers around. We've talked in previous videos about the baby boom after World War II, a significant rise in the birth rate. And look at that statistic there. By the end of the 50s, around 1 in 10 of the population were teenagers. So they're a really key group in society. If you run a business, if you are marketing or advertising a business, you've got to try and appeal to teenagers. And so the music industry and the fashion industry in particular, very much aiming a lot of their products at teenagers. They are an economically powerful group within society. And that all helps teenagers to develop their own confident, separate culture. Add in the fact that teenagers, like adults in the period, are generally speaking more affluent. They're benefiting from those rising living standards that we've talked about. And all of that contributes to a confident, separate, different teenage culture. And it's no surprise that by the time we get to 1959, 1960, you've got a lot of new magazines and TV programmes specifically aimed at teenagers. You've got some new technology, for example, the transistor radio. All of that is being used to spread and to maintain this new teenage culture. So this rise of the teenager, this changing and more confident youth culture is a really important aspect of these wider social changes that we're seeing. A little bit more about youth culture. What we find is particular groups emerging within society as part of that teenage culture. 3 groups in particular to introduce you to. First of all, the Teddy Boys. Now, this is a group who emerged in the early 1950s. Now, in many ways, the way in which they dress goes back not to their parents' generation, but to an older time, to the Edwardian era of 1901 to 1910. The Teddy Boys dress very smartly. They've got these long coats, these narrow trousers, but combined with the very smart dress is quite a significant amount of violence. At its worst, Teddy Boy culture is partly linked to some of those race riots we talked about earlier in the video. But there are pockets of other violence as well within Teddy Boy culture. So the Teddy Boys look very different to their parents, but also in sometimes quite an aggressive way. They challenge some of the values of the older generation. By the time we move into the mid-50s, the Teddy Boys have pretty much disappeared. What we get instead is 2 other groups of teenagers who are very much in competition with each other. We've got the mods and we've got the rockers. Now, the mods are into pop music, generally dress pretty smartly, often wearing suits, and they ride scooters. The rockers, slightly different on every one of those counts. They're into rock and roll. You've got Elvis Presley, key figure in rock and roll in the US. Bill Haley, who's his British equivalent as well. The rockers tend to wear leather, and they ride heavy motorbikes. So these are 2 visibly different groups, and it's not just that they have a different way of life and a different way of expressing youth culture, but they clash in a pretty violent way. There are some very notorious, very infamous cases where there were huge, organised, pre-planned clashes, mods versus rockers, often in seaside towns like Brighton and Margate in 1964. Brighton was particularly bad. You've got 2 days of fighting. You've got the police. There's loads of them, but they struggle to get this one under control. Not surprisingly, the media panic and the media whip up real fear. The media had always exaggerated the extent of Teddy Boy violence. They do the same with the mods and the rockers. You get all these hysterical headlines about thugs wielding knives and the very fabric of society being destroyed by these crazy new groups of young people. Now, is there violence? Well, yes, there is. It was true with the Teddy Boys, it's true with the mods and the rockers. Is the very fabric of society under threat by these people fighting on the beach in Clacton? No, it isn't. So the media reports are true to a certain extent, but this is very much an example of what we call a moral panic. The media is massively exaggerating the threat to the whole of society. Nevertheless, these are further examples of changing youth culture. The fact that there are loads of different groups of young people now who are prepared to express themselves in new and different ways to their parents. Some more aspects of changing culture that it's worth reflecting on, and this part of the video focuses very much on the media. A couple of examples of TV programmes which reflect changing attitudes in society. We've got a couple of crime and police programmes. Sapphire is a pretty groundbreaking one. Sex, violence, racial tension, lots of issues which really hadn't been explored in the early days of television. Even when we look at police dramas, we can see social change. There'd been a very traditional series called Dixon of Dock Green, which was a classic police series earlier in the 50s, with the friendly local policeman with his catchphrase, "Evening all." Now that's replaced by Z-Cars. Z-Cars is a bit more hard-hitting. It's set on Merseyside. It is gritty. It's much more a reflection of changing British society. In terms of fiction as well, we've got A Clockwork Orange, a very famous novel by Anthony Burgess, made into an iconic, powerful and very disturbing film later on as well. And this really does pull no punches in the way that it depicts gang violence. So not only is British society changing, but we can see examples in the media, in literature, in culture, which reflect those changes too. Another example from 1962 is the work of Ken Loach, who's still around today. Cathy Come Home is a really powerful piece of drama focused on the issue of homelessness. So we've got playwrights, we've got authors, filmmakers, TV scriptwriters, all of whom are trying to reflect through their work some of these changes and changing attitudes in British society. And a final issue to look at, which also reflects the scale of social change, is around issues to do with censorship and taboos. In other words, areas which would not previously have been discussed openly. And in the late 50s and the early 60s, we see a real drive among areas of society to try and break down some of those taboos and also to try and stop some of the censorship that had existed within the British media. A couple more examples of groundbreaking works. We've got A Taste of Honey here, 1958 film by Sheila Delaney, and look at what that's all about. So you've got a young woman, she's unmarried, and yet she becomes pregnant. That in itself was still relatively scandalous at the time, but not only does she become pregnant, it's after having sex with a black sailor. So A Taste of Honey is groundbreaking and it's controversial. Equally, even though it may not seem it now, the film Victim in 1961 is controversial because it uses the word homosexual. No English film had done that up to that point. All of these are signs of changing attitudes and the beginnings of the breaking down of some of these taboos. Maybe the most famous example of all is Lady Chatterley's Lover. It's a novel by D.H. Lawrence. It's sexually explicit, features some relatively graphic descriptions of sexual activity. And this was published by Penguin, the famous publishers, in 1962, and Penguin were taken to court. We still had a law in place called the Obscenity Act, and Penguin are taken to court. The argument is that this is an obscene piece of work, that it should be banned, and the really important thing here is that Penguin win. Now this is massive, because something like Lady Chatterley's Lover, although to our modern eyes might not appear all that explicit, at the time this was hugely controversial. The fact that the judges rule in favour of Penguin shows that attitudes are changing. Very interesting as well, because actually the campaigners against Lady Chatterley lose twice. Not only did he lose the case, but all of a sudden the publicity generates massive sales. About 2 million copies of Lady Chatterley are subsequently sold. Nevertheless, some of these campaigners are not going to back down, and in fact their voices only get louder. A really famous name is Mary Whitehouse. She begins a crusade against what she sees as the obscene changes in British culture. She uses words like immoral and depraved to describe some of these works of literature, some of these new films and TV programmes that we've talked about. She's very concerned about sex, about violence, about swearing. Interestingly, it's not just about these small c conservative campaigners, people who have very traditional social attitudes. It's also the case that some people on the left of politics, some Labour Party figures, are quite concerned about attitudes in society. Now, they have a different perspective on this, but what they say is that society is becoming increasingly materialistic. People are becoming more and more obsessed with owning stuff, with goods, and that in some way it's making people forget the basics of what holds society together. Values of decency, values of kindness, values of generosity, values of looking after those who are less fortunate. And people on the left say we're becoming too materialistic, too individualistic, and less concerned with the rest of society. So the criticisms of social change are interesting because they're not just coming from perhaps the more obvious quarters. And that leads us really to a final really important conclusion, and it's something that we've talked about quite a lot through both of these last two videos. It's the fact that as we look at society in Britain in the 50s and the 60s, we do see significant social change in terms of the role of women, in terms of race, in terms of censorship, in terms of youth culture, in terms of affluence. There is significant change, and in terms of attitudes to the establishment as well. But nevertheless, this is not in any way a revolution. A lot of people in British society remain relatively traditional and relatively conservative in their attitudes, even by the time we get to 1964. Yes, the 60s in particular are a time of significant change. Yes, they've gone down in history as a decade of real change. But if you were to meet your average British person in 1964, don't be surprised if you find they have some pretty conservative and pretty traditional attitudes.
Thank you very much, Tom. Another excellent and informative video. I hope you've all found that really helpful and has deepened your understanding of social developments in Britain from this time period. If you've enjoyed it, then please hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to us already, please subscribe and get notifications of further videos, not only on this topic, but on other history topics and also on A-level politics. And please leave us some comment if you need any further help, you want some further information, or you just want to say something about the video. Thank you very much for watching. See you all soon.